Hey everyone, welcome to Ask a Political Scientist. I'm Andrea Jones-Rooy. I am your host. I am so thrilled that you are here. Thank you for joining us. I hope everyone is well and safe. This is our last Ask a Political Scientist of the summer/spring season that we have had. We've done 20 of these shows. Today is the 20th show. When I started this way back when we all first realized that our lives were about to go to hell in March, I thought I'd do maybe 4 or 5. But here we all are. We have done 20 of these. I am so thankful to all of you for being here, and especially to those who have come pretty much every time to this show. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment. But we have an amazing show for you tonight. I am so happy you are here. Let us get into it. So this is indeed Ask a Political Scientist. I am Andrea Jones-Rooy. I am a political scientist and a stand-up comedian. And this is a show where we bring political science and stand-up comedy together at last. I know, it's what we've all been asking for. For those of you who are joining us for the first time and or don't already know what political science is a very simple 2-step process. It involves 1, use scientific methods to understand politics. And then 2, and this is very important, then be totally ignored by policymakers, voters, and everybody else, including my own family. Until now, there are a lot of people trying to get the good news about political science research out there in the world. I am not the only one, but that is the goal of this show. And I do want to acknowledge that, here, let's have a closer look at this, that my family has been very supportive of this show, and many of them have come to most of these shows, and I think they effectively have PhDs in political science, so thank you to them. And in particular, because this is the 20th show, I want to say a big, huge, sappy thank you to those of you who are here tonight, but especially those of you who have come to all of the shows or close to all of the shows. Now, I want to name a few people specifically, but I also want to respect people's privacy, and I realize that many people don't want their names just living on YouTube. So I will be thanking a few people. Sorry, everyone, this is a mini Oscars speech, and there is no music to play me off, but I will keep this brief. So I want to thank a few people, but I'm going to do it with some nicknames, so hopefully you know who you are. So big thanks go to M. Sita, try to guess who that is, and D.O., who knows who that could be. Bo's Brain, thank you so much for watching. Nort, thank you for watching. Rushy, thank you for watching. Subway J, Long Arms, you don't know I call you that, but that's what I'm calling you. Di, thank you for watching the show. James, Neo Wise, I hope you know who you are. Thank you for watching. I'm being so cryptic. This is such a weird cult, but this is just my family, and I just don't want to put them on YouTube without their permission, and I guess I could have asked, but here we go. But I also want to flag that during the course of this show, we had a new member join the family. He was born around show 15. That's how I'll keep track of his birthday. So big welcome to the cousin I will call T-Bone to the world, and thank you for watching this show. All right, so those are my sappy thanks. Now we'll go back to a normal show. The topic for today's show is, what is belonging and how does it affect politics? We are going to talk about 3 big things in the course of my interview with our amazing guest and our comedian guest. We are going to talk about belonging. We're going to talk about political behavior that results from belonging. And then we're going to talk about how that plays out among political elites, not just the rest of us running around in this country. So those are the 3 topics that are going to shape our conversation. Our guest political scientist today, I am so excited that she is here with us. We have Angela X. Ocampo. She can be found on Twitter right here at Angela X. Ocampo. She is a professor at the University of Michigan. I feel very glad that we get to go out with a University of Michigan faculty member. I got my PhD at Michigan, and as those of you who've been watching the show know, there is a big pro-Michigan bias. So I did not plan it this way to have the last person be from Michigan, but I'm ultra thrilled that we do. So thank you. Yay, Michigan. Okay. She got her PhD at UCLA, and you can read all about her research right here at her website. I'm going to show a few highlights of my of the research that I think is super exciting. But first, heck, let's bring Angela onto the show. So please join me, if you are watching from home, clap like a crazy person to give a very warm welcome to Angela. Here she is. Welcome to the show. Everyone. How are you?
Good. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you for being here. Are you staying sane and well and all that in this crazy time?
Yes, try my best.
Very good. Well, I see some green in that window behind you, which is more than I can say here in New York City. So yeah. Thank you for the exposure to nature. Are you ready for a weird rundown of your research said out loud by me?
Yes, I'm
All right.
excited.
All right, great.
Highlights are.
Great. So here are the highlights. For those of you who don't already know Angela's work, it is awesome. Here is some of what she is up to. Might be a little bit hard to read, but I want to flag a couple of papers that she has written. This one is called "Many Are Called, But Few Are Chosen: The Emergence of Latino Congressional Candidates." We'll absolutely be talking about Latino congressional candidates at the end of our interview. And another topic that's really potentially of interest to everyone, but especially folks who've been watching this show over time, because we've talked about things like threat and anger before on this show. And this is a paper called Somos Más: How Racial Threat and Anger Mobilized Latino Voters in the Trump Era. So we'll be talking about that. Angela, I have wanted to ask you questions already about these, but we're going to save it for the interview. She does a lot of research on the Latinx community, but not just the Latinx community. Here is a paper about the American Muslim voter and how community and belonging are related to political participation in this community. The influence of political networks in majority Latino districts. Even a paper in Spanish. Angela, what does this mean?
So this is sort of the weight of the Latino vote in 2016, how influential it was.
How influential was it?
Quite influential, very influential, yeah.
Great. And a preview for where we're going. How influential do you think it will be in 2020 if we have an election? Let's not even think about that news coming out right now.
Incredibly influential, very significant.
Excellent.
But I think we'll have to think about the COVID factor too. So
this is true. This is true. So we will be diving into that quite a bit. But this is totally awesome. And thank you for refreshing my very crappy high school Spanish. I did look up what peso meant. And so thank you for the vocabulary. Her dissertation, which is now in the process of becoming a book, is called The Politics of Inclusion: A Sense of Belonging to U.S. Society and Latino Political Participation. It won the APSA, American Political Science Association Award for Best Dissertation. That's a very big deal in race, ethnicity, and politics. So we'll be talking lots about that book project. And finally, Angela has tons of papers on the horizon, working papers, forthcoming papers. One of the ones that stood out to me, Angela, is this one: Disaggregating the Latino-X Umbrella, the Political Attitudes of U.S. Colombians, which is forthcoming at Latino Studies. Why is it so important to disaggregate this Latinx umbrella?
Because Latinos are not a monolith. So I think, Colombians are one of the least studied subgroup. And part of that is because we haven't had much data to study them. And so I'm really excited about this paper and really excited about some of the findings that we have as we compare Colombians to other national origin groups and find some interesting nuances there with regards to their political identification and participation.
Excellent. Well, congrats on the forthcoming paper coming out this year. So be on the lookout for it. And I'll definitely be asking you about how we can, the importance of continuing to think about this community not as a monolith, which I think a lot of political science and a lot of political analysis certainly does. So we'll be coming back to that for sure. So that is a very quick overview of Angela. We're going to dive into your research lots and lots in mere moments. But first, are you ready to bring our comedian guest to the show?
Yes.
Hooray. Hooray, hooray. All right. So our comedian guest today, he is Igor Martinez. He is a stand-up comedian based in New York City. You can follow him on Instagram and Twitter at Iggy Smalls Jokes. You win the prize for a way more fun Twitter handle than I have. You've seen him if you're in New York City at the New York Underground Comedy Festival. He also performs all over the city back when we could go outside, including such legendary places as the Creek and the Cave, Levity Live, and the Lantern Comedy, which is where we know each other from. So Igor, here you are. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Hey, how's it going? Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you for being here. Are you staying safe and sane and all that?
Sure. I started doing puzzles, so that's where I'm at in my quarantine.
Okay, great. Like jigsaw or crossword or?
No, the pieces, the 500 pieces so far.
Okay. What puzzle are you working on?
I just got one called Little Scientists. So they're like little baby versions of like big scientists. I'm a child, so
that's perfect. I will now do everything I can to get Angela made into a puzzle to be added to Little Scientists. That's maybe the creepiest thing I've ever said on YouTube. But that would be great. All right, so Igor, so I have a bit of a This Is Your Life as well to introduce you to folks watching. Are you ready for that?
Yeah, hit me with it.
Hooray, here it comes. All right, so he performs all over New York City for sure. Here he is at the Lantern Comedy Club, which is where I used to perform. I'm sorry, I can't find a better picture, but I think this sums up the spirit of the Lantern quite well. It's a comedy club in New York City that's in the back of a bar in Greenwich Village. And I don't know, I'm nostalgic for it. Igor, how are you feeling about everything being shut down?
Absolutely. I mean, we used to be able to just like cough and sneeze all over each other.
Yeah.
And it was funny. It would result in laughter. So.
Yeah, I mean, that microphone that Igor is holding, we all used to put it right in our faces.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Some people farted on it. Some people coughed on it. It's,
comedy. All right. But Igor, you have been doing a lot of Zoom comedy shows. One of the more recent ones is a series called No, But What's Your Real Job, which is run by a friend of mine and friend of the show, Abby Washuda. How is it for you doing comedy on Zoom?
It's different. It took me a while to get acclimated to it, or to just come around to the idea of doing it. But the way I describe it to people, it's like the live experience. You can't replace the live experience, but doing it online is like 20 to 30% of the experience, which is better than zero. So,
yes, very good. Look at you, glass half full. I like it.
Yeah.
And now through some true stalking, I also learned that you did an outdoor show recently.
Yes.
How was that?
That's it's better than the internet comedy because it's obviously live, but in that set right in the middle there was a garbage truck picking up garbage,
right?
So you hear the machinery of the actual truck, and then the backing up sound, so it makes it more fun. There's a lot more factors that are distracting, but it's still fun.
Yeah, that sounds like a very authentic New York City comedy experience. Like, it's just a huge trash truck. So there you go.
Yeah.
All right. Well, glad to hear that there's a little bit of life coming back. And I just pulled this out because it's on topic for what we're talking about. You did a show at the end of last year called Press Uno for English, which was Latinx stand-up comedians take over the pit. And there's a pretty big Latinx stand-up comedy community here in New York. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say so. Not as big as some other communities, but yeah, it's definitely present for sure.
Excellent. Cool. Very cool. Well, we had Stewie on a few weeks ago, and he was talking about Spanish language comedy going on in New York too, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Do you do that as well?
I don't. I haven't. I speak Spanish. I'm pretty fluent at it, but I'm still just kind of embarrassed at having to kind of translate and trying to do that whole thing. But it's more on me.
All right.
But not yet.
All right, so I shouldn't ask you to just switch to Spanish for the rest of the show.
Not the whole show, but I can definitely flaunt a little bit.
Very good. All right, so and just finally, for nostalgia's sake, this is the outside of the Lantern, and Igor and I know each other from performing, but also from barking, which is a very embarrassing exercise. Here's us. We are creepy ghosts standing outside the Lantern, where we ask passersby if they want to watch a free comedy show, and they say no, and then we say, do you want a $5 frozen margarita? And they say yes. And then we do comedy at them afterwards. So that's how we know each other from many long winters standing outside. So it's great to see you while we're all indoors. It is actually an improvement. So that is Igor. Welcome to the show. We're so thrilled to have you.
Thank you.
The very last thing I want to say before we dive into the interview is we raise money every week for different organizations. If you are able to contribute at all, I understand that many people cannot, and that is, I am sorry, we've all lost our jobs, so no worries. But if you can contribute, the price of a ticket, whatever you want, if this were a real show, that would be great. And you can click, there's a link in the chat, but there's also this link right here. And all money will go straight this week to Kids in Need of Defense, also known as KIND. And Angela, this was actually your suggestion. Do you have a particular connection with this organization, or just like it because they're doing great work?
Yeah, well, I know someone who works at KIND, but also I think that the work that they do is incredible, and it's important. I think given, the current circumstances, right? A lot of these children don't have legal representation. They're, unaccompanied minors or refugee children. And so the work that they do is really important. And, given the work that I do too, it's connected to that. So I figured it'd be a perfect organization to fundraise for.
Excellent. Yeah, I have been reading all about them, and it's both super important and very tragic work, right? It's unaccompanied minors, refugee children in the country who have need legal defense, and also they offer it, trauma support and other sort of family related support as well. So if you're able to donate, every single last penny that goes to our PayPal here will go straight, and I'll donate it first thing tomorrow, and I will show you a receipt if you want to see it. So great. So that's where that's going. All right, let us dive into the conversation. We're talking about belonging, how it influences behavior. and how it plays out with political beliefs. As we go, this is an interactive show. You can send us questions in the YouTube chat, and I will do my best to keep up with them and toss them to Angela as well. And if you have questions for Igor, I'll toss them there also. So don't be shy, ask us questions. Let's get into it. All right, so Angela, I want to dive right in on belonging. I'm curious why you study belonging, but let's lay some groundwork first and say, so what does belonging mean in the context of your research?
Sure. So belonging in the context of my research specifically is about it. So that it has two components, this concept, both thinking about an individual sense of belonging, right? Whether or not people feel that they are members of the community, and in this case, U.S. society, right? Because it's what the project focuses on. And then there's relative understanding, right? The extent to which they perceive that others are inclusive of them or that include them, right? So it has these two components, and I call this the politics of inclusion framework. But belonging, right, has been studied for quite some time in a lot of other disciplines. And it is, sort of in its sort of more kind of basic sense and understanding is the idea that you feel like you are part of a particular group or community. And that could be a work setting, a school setting, right? In the context of my research, it is specific about U.S. society as a whole.
Okay, so it's this idea that I myself, it's a perception about, let me make sure I got this right, that it's a perception that I have about my own self and my own membership or acceptance in the group. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay.
And then as part of that too, right? So that would be the individual component. And then it has this relative component, right? So you also would evaluate the extent to which you think other people are inclusive of you, right? So it is, do I feel like I belong? Yes or no? Or maybe, there's some variation within that. And then to what extent do people include me in our respect or respect me and my membership in U.S. society?
So I'm really glad you said this, because I think inclusion is a word that inclusion and belonging are both words that, as you said, come up in the workplace as well as in politics. And I think in the last few months, definitely are part of a national conversation. So this distinction is really helpful. So inclusion is whether the group accepts you, as opposed to belonging, which is whether I see myself as part of the group. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, correct. And then you can perceive inclusion, right? Then you, as an individual, perceive the extent to which society or other people in that society are being inclusive of you.
So is a different point of view?
So I think that's where the nuance is, right? And a lot of the sort of the work that I'm looking at is more psychological. So those that are doing their evaluation, in this case, people in the Latino community, sort of, we already talked about how that's it's not a monolith, right? But within that, we include a lot of people. So what does that mean for Latinos and Latinas or of different socioeconomic status, national origin? How do they understand their sense of belonging in the U.S.? And to what extent do they perceive that others include them and respect their presence in the U.S.?
Is it possible to have to feel that I belong, but also perceive that I am not included in society?
Yes.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. And that's also at the core of the work that I do, right? So it's this distinction between you making a claim of membership and feeling like you belong, like you very much belong. This is your home, the place where maybe you weren't born here, but you made this your home because you migrated and you believe that you belong here. But yet you perceive that other people are not inclusive of you, that they exclude you, that they don't respect and value your membership, right? And so those two could be at odds.
So, and I'm thinking now about, the organization that we're raising money for, right? So Kids in Need of Defense. So children who are here who perhaps, I would imagine believe that they belong here, but there are people in the United States who believe that they don't, right? And the conversations around DACA, Dreamers, generally. Is that a fair example of this sort of this possibility of feeling you belong but not feeling that you're included?
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So that's one way to think about it, right? So we can think of students, for example, dreamers and documented students who they themselves feel like they belong, right? And when you think about a big part of the movement has been about the extent to which they believe that they belong, and they make strong claims about membership, yet they are perceived by others as not belonging and as not really being part of U.S. society. And there's a lot of nuance there. And there's a lot of work by a lot of other really awesome scholars that finds that despite the fact that they might make these claims of belonging, there's other spaces and places where they may not necessarily feel that strong sense of belonging, right? So I guess we'll talk a little bit more about what might impact perceptions of belonging within the community, and what factors are associated, what other things shape those perceptions. But yes.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. And we're going to dive in on sort of why this is so important and how it influences our behavior in politics, and frankly, probably your sense of self and other big parts of your life. But before we dive into that, so you do quite empirical work typically. How do you measure something as abstract like a sense of belonging or a perception that others believe you belong or that you're included?
Yeah. So, in many ways, it's kind of the work that we do as political scientists, right? Really try to, and the way that we call it, right, operationalize this measure. So basically take this from what we are trying to measure and come up with a specific marker to assess that that idea or that concept. So given that in some ways belonging had been studied by political scientists, but not as in depth, right, as I hope my book does, I borrowed and I relied on a lot of the work that had been done by psychologists and sociologists to really get a sense of, like, how do we measure these perceptions of belonging, right? So I use questions that will ask respondents in surveys, although I've also done some qualitative work on this, and we'll specifically ask them their perceptions of belonging. And I have 4 particular questions that I ask in all of my surveys. And these 4 questions I developed, again, after doing some extensive qualitative work, but also borrowing from these existing measures in other disciplines to come up with the specific items that I ask people to assess their perceptions of belonging and perceive respect and sort of value of their membership in U.S. society.
Excellent. So I want to flag first, I have more questions on this. You use the word operationalize, and I forget if we've used this word in this show before, but it is one of my absolutely all-time favorite words. Igor, where are you landing on operationalization and operationalize?
Oh, I mean, that's when you have a plan and then you execute it.
I mean, that's basically it.
Like, I wanted to go to the grocery store today. I did it. I operationalized going to the grocery store.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And so I guess to use that example, right, the way that you would assess that, right, would be when you come home and you look at all the things that you bought, right? Like what did you get from the grocery store, right? Like, did you actually do this, right? Is that sort of what you have a measure or a proxy to assess whether or not, right, you went to the grocery store. So yes, you bought apples and broccoli and chips and I don't know, some other quarantine snacks.
That's literally all. I buy frozen broccoli and chips, and then I keep buying more chips and I don't eat the frozen broccoli. That's literally what's in my house right here. So very on point. Yes.
Well, if you get injured, you have a bunch of bags of iced broccoli. So
this is true. I will be sitting on that broccoli very soon. But I love this analogy so much. So I teach a course at NYU on data science, and we talk about operationalization all the time, and the students totally hate it. And so your analogy is way better than mine. But to your point, so I went out to try to get apples. I come home. I didn't get apples. I got peaches. I operationalized incorrectly, right? I didn't pick up apples, or in your case, belonging. How do you know if your measure is picking up belonging after you've used it?
So I also, so I assess the measure against other measures that others would make the case are or are not belonging, right? So in how I do that, I also, when I collect the data, I assess, for example, perceptions of discrimination. I ask questions about American identity, pan-ethnic identity, and other kind of similarly situated concepts and ideas around belonging to tease out whether or not what I'm picking up with these questions about belonging is actually different or how closely related it is to these other concepts, and also to assess sort of its individual explanatory power, right? So is there something else that these measures of belonging are telling me about political behavior that are useful, right? Or am I just kind of wasting my time and sort of measuring other things that other political scientists have come up with in the past?
Right. I see. So if it doesn't have any explanatory power towards things you care about, who cares what you're picking up? Because whether it's belonging or not, it's not informative, or a sign that you're not picking up belonging if you have a real reason to expect belonging would influence. So I want to jump to behavior in a second, but just curious, do you, not to make you, if you don't have it memorized, that's totally fine, but what's an example of the sorts of questions you ask to find out if someone feels that they belong?
Yeah. So I guess the one sort of it's, kind of a face value is one of them. And the wording, I've done some testing with the wording, right, to tease out like the whether that matters too, right, how I ask the question. But one of the questions I use, how strongly do you feel like you belong in the United States? To what extent do you believe that other Americans value and appreciate your presence in the United States? To what extent, I can't remember its exact wording, but to what extent do you perceive that others are inclusive of you?
Are those like 1 to 10 scale?
They go from 1 to 4 or 1 to 5.
Okay.
Like a strongly agree kind of scale, or something else? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do those three, I'm curious now, I'm like, I want everyone in the audience. I imagine that this was, they're directed towards the Latinx community, but everyone who's watching, if you want to shout, do you feel you belong, and do you feel welcome in American society? I would love to hear what you all think. Igor, where do you land? I'm curious. Do you feel, because I guess I feel like I belong, but I don't think about it, and I have
in America,
privilege, but yeah.
I feel like I belong. Especially because living in New York City, it's like, who the hell belongs? You know, it's kind of like that question. It's like, well, if nobody belongs, then everybody belongs, kind of a thing. But yeah, no, for sure, I definitely feel like I belong. And more, and I felt that it's weird. And again, I think it's in New York City more than ever. It's like it's a paradox of I belong, but at the same time, I feel like I don't belong because there's so many different groups of people. Where at the same time, it's like I don't really see my group, but then it's like, oh, everybody's in this kind of same boat. So I think I also relate with them. So yes, I do belong.
Angela, what got you interested in this topic in the first place?
That's a great question. So, I guess from my personal, I think a lot of the work that I do is centered around my own experience of migration to the U.S. And so trying to understand and map out what life it was like to this new country that I migrated to, that in many ways sort of has influenced and has shaped my interest for studying race and dissident politics, and more specifically Latinx politics. But I just sort of remember vividly growing up in this really kind of interesting place, right? White Plains, New York, Westchester County, really interesting place. And realizing, right, that it was
interesting is code for something.
Yeah, no. Westchester is many things. Not many people describe it as interesting. Nothing against Westchester, but it's not an adjective I hear.
Well, so just straighten up the interesting.
Yeah. It's a great community. It's a great community. But sort of thinking about it's a suburb, right? So there was White Plains was a great place for me to grow up and sort of really look at the I try to understand basically the dynamics of what we're going on. White Plains is a pretty diverse city, yet Westchester is there's a lot of inequality in terms of concentrations of racial and ethnic groups, but also a lot of income inequality within different particular cities, right? So if you compare a town like Scarsdale, right, even to White Plains, but to other places like Yonkers, right? So it's just huge discrepancies in terms of a lot of different markers. And so I grew up in this place, right? And having recently arrived from Colombia, just trying to get a sense of where do I fit in this community, right? And trying to navigate all of that, I think, has shaped my interest. I think at the same time, I was also intrigued within the race and ethnic politics and the Latinx politics literature. A lot of the work has always focused on thinking about threat as a mobilizer, right? And how threat has mobilized people to participate in, right? And there's sort of important work that has given us an understanding of how threat and perceived discrimination can influence Latinos to engage in different ways, and trying to kind of tease out why and under what context maybe threat might not work, right? And how belonging might also matter in different ways, and sort of thinking about what are some of the nuances around that.
So if I got it right, so a lot of people said, okay, so what motivates Latinos to go out and vote? Well, it must be when they experience a negative, so a threat, like a discrimination or a fear about a changing policy that would harm them. Therefore, they're going to go out and vote or do whatever, right?
Yes.
So are you the first to flip to this more positive? Because it seems like a glass half full or a let's talk about the positive influences to participation.
Yeah, no, so I'm not the first, right? I think there are other people that have begun to do some of the work, and I'll give a shout out to another UMich PhD, Vanessa Cruz-Nichols, who does a lot of really interesting work as well, looking at participation in the Latinx community and looking at instances where there could be, where opportunities can, certain types of opportunities can, in a positive way, can increase mobilization in the Latinx community, and why threat in some cases might under-mobilize the community. And so, if people are interested in this work, they should check out her work.
Yes. Yes, Vanessa is a friend of mine, friend of the show, an open invitation to come on and share her work as well, but definitely check out her work. So we've touched on this political participation. Why is it that belonging matters so much if we want to think about someone engaging in politics, and what forms do those take? We mentioned voting, but what else?
Sure. So, I mean, I guess, belonging matters, and I'll just kind of say this briefly, and I know I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but, psychologists really tell us that belonging is a human need, right? Mm-hmm. Just like there's a need for food and shelter, right? There's also a need to feel like you belong and you're part of groups. So it's a really important need to fulfill, right? And given its importance, right, and given what other research has shown, it is just in many ways natural to think that belonging also matters for how people relate to politics, and not just, and of course, all people, right? But thinking about people who have been marginalized historically and who have had really in many ways decades and centuries, right, long fight for inclusion and for equal inclusion. And so that is sort of thinking about why belonging matters, right? And why we should really think about this framework as sort of helping us understand how this concept is at the core of political participation, especially for racial and ethnic minorities, given their marginalization. And when thinking about outcomes, right, so I did talk about voting, but in my work, I also find that it is just as equally as important for other types of participation, such as discussing politics, engaging in protests, although there's some caveats there with the direction in which belonging is working, and also for registration, right? So perceptions of belonging matter for whether or not you become a registered voter, whether or not you engage at the local or neighborhood level to solve community issues, So it's more than voting, right? It's a long, it can be both, I guess, formal electoral participation and also non-electoral, which includes becoming involved right at the local level to address issues in your community.
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up because we've talked over the last few shows about we're all hyper-focused on the national level for, I think, pretty obvious reasons, but the importance of the difference you can make at the local level in all kinds of involvements and educating yourself. And that's where, rules get changed that really affect you, I think is such an important point. Igor, are you particularly politically active? I don't know if we've chatted about this before.
No,
okay.
I'm not.
Your
no.
face, yeah.
Yeah, no. I try to stay away from that. And I know it's, everybody should do their part and contribute and have their voice heard. But I leave that up to much smarter people than me. And I hope that's where I hope that people that are doing those things are doing it for the best interest of everybody. But as we can see, sometimes they're not. So
understatement of the non-partisan show, but understatement right there. We have a question. So you're actually interesting. You're the opposite trend of, I guess, what we're describing, which is high belonging, lower participation, which of course, these trends aren't always 100%, but that's right. That is interesting. We have a question that from the audience asking, this is an interesting twist that I hadn't thought of, from Don Rushman: is belonging different from tribalism? And I think tribalism has some really complicated connotations around it. But I'm curious your thoughts on tribalism versus belonging or even inclusion.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess I'm sort of curious, maybe if they could, sort of thinking about how can we think of maybe tribalism as, it's a great question. And I don't know maybe the extent to which I hadn't sort of given this much thought, right? How it relates to tribalism. But I mean, I think what I can say, right, is that this idea of belonging is really at the core of any sort of like national building or sort of groupie building phenomenon, right? And in this case, in many ways, it does speak to belonging to U.S. society as a whole, right? And so even though, right, for the most part, we have sort of painted this positive picture of what belonging is, I will say, right, that I think it sort of gets tricky because different groups will are thinking about belonging in different ways, right? And even different individuals will talk about belonging in different ways, right? So what does belonging to U.S. society mean to certain particular people is different from what it might mean to others. And I've asked in some of my interviews and even some of my open-ended questions of the surveys, right? What does this mean to you? How do you understand this, right? And so some people will say, well, I don't feel like I belong because X, Y, and Z. I do feel like I belong because X, Y, and Z. And usually the people that do, for the most part, right, that they'll talk about having a high sense of belonging will talk about things that are related to national ideas of the melting pot or things like that, right? And oftentimes those who talk about lack of perceived belonging will talk about sort of the constant marginalization that they face, the exclusion that they face, the limited representation that they see, or limited in the way that perhaps the president talks about their community, sort of those things. So I guess that's how I connected to tribalism a little bit.
Yeah, the follow-up question is if one is a subset of the other, and it sounds like maybe if you feel you belong, you then could be primed to have some sort of in-group, out-group, or like sort of tribalist ideas about national pride or something like that, maybe.
Yes.
So overall, how are the belonging levels among the Latinx community in the U.S.? Again, recognizing it's not a monolith, but high, low, where?
Yeah, so they're actually surprisingly, on average, pretty high, right? Okay. Compared to what we would imagine that would be given political current climate and political rhetoric around the community. There is variation by subsets of the community. And so I did sort of talk a little bit about that, in that, of course, those who are foreign born are less likely to perceive that they belong than those who are native born. On average, there's also variation by things like socioeconomic status. So level of education, income, that matters a lot. Skin color, perceived skin color also plays a big role in your perception of belonging, right? Which speaks to a whole bunch of different interesting things there. So, interestingly, right, in sort of given this, there are pretty, I would say, moderate to high levels of belonging. And I would say this compared to other groups, right? And I think that it's sort of, we're thinking about compared to which other groups am I talking about. Whites, of course, have the highest perceptions of belonging, followed by Latinos, and then followed by both Asian Americans and Blacks, who have among sort of the lowest levels of belonging across the 4 items that I measure.
Comparably low, or like both quite low, or is one definitely the lowest compared to?
I would say both comparably quite low. It sort of depends on which questions I ask. Asian Americans scored the lowest on this item that I have about, which I forgot to mention earlier, about perceived being an insider or an outsider. So they have strong perceptions of being outsiders compared to, for example, Blacks, which in many ways that makes sense, right? But at other levels,
Oh, I was just curious when you, and this is like probably going back a little bit, but when you ask people about, their sense of belonging to America, do you also ask like where they grew up, and is their area predominantly, if they're Latino area, if they're Asian American, if they grew up in a mostly Asian American neighborhood?
So that's it's a great question. Yes, so we have that data. I have that data, and I've looked at that data. So, I would say not necessarily where they grew up or where they live now.
Okay.
So, I have information about all of their demographics and their zip code, and I believe even in some surveys, their particular block group where they are, right? So I have data, I have appended data to this survey with the demographic markers of the neighborhood where they live. So this allows me to assess, the extent to which you live in a diverse community, sort of being defined by a mixed neighborhood that has some sort of different percentages of every racial and ethnic group. Does that make you feel like you belong more versus belong less, right? For example.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, you said you came from Colombia, right?
Yes.
And then you moved to White Plains.
Yes.
Which like that for me, it's because I was born in Venezuela, but then I moved to South Florida, which is it's Cuba. It's a small version of Cuba. So I had like it was still very Hispanic. So I still like, it felt like just a slight transition from home, you know what I mean? So I think that helped me in belonging. Whereas if I were to move to an area where it was like predominantly white, it would feel less like I belonged. So that's why it was just, I'm curious as to what my experience would have been like if I had moved to White Plains.
Yeah. So that's certainly the case, right? Like that context where not only where you grew up and where you are, but where you might move to has a huge impact. And some of the qualitative work that I've done of people, they tell me, I felt like I belong back, where I grew up in this predominantly Latino neighborhood. But once I moved to this other area for work or for school, I didn't feel like I belong anymore. And all of these things, I was no longer like the average person, right? I kind of, in many ways, had to adjust and also had to explain my presence, right? It's what people say, I had to explain sort of my background, my presence in those spaces. So that's certainly the case. I would add, though, that I think contrary to the reason why also I said interesting earlier, I think contrary to how Westchester is painted, and even White Plains, there's a lot of diversity in White Plains. That you wouldn't really expect, sort of thinking that you're only thinking of this predominantly sort of white and rich suburban community, but it's it's interesting, right? Because there's a lot of diversity, even though you don't really expect it.
Right.
I am now going to ask Westchester and White Plains for sponsorship for future episodes of this show. Like, have you considered wonderful, diverse White Plains? But that is Igor, a great point. And thank you for sharing your experience. And yeah, depending on, and it sounds like it plays out in your data, Angela, that where you are in the U.S., who you are and where you are influences whether or not you feel you belong in the U.S. as a whole. I have a question here from Beth, who is going exactly where I was headed. Has the sense of belonging changed under Trump for any of the groups that you've studied?
That's a great question. So let me see. I have some data from pre-Trump through Trump, and I'm getting ready to collect more data now as in 2020. Right. So I'll be able to better assess whether or not there's been big changes. So I will say that on average, we haven't seen huge changes in the data that I'm looking at. The data that I look at are sort of have to be taken for what they are, and are useful in many ways, but also have some limitations because I'm not necessarily looking within particular pockets of the community. So the data that I look at are, for the most part, registered voters or adults, right? And I haven't found many changes over time. But again, I will be able to see once I have this new data that's collected in 2020. I will add, though, that in a lot of the other work that I've done, through experiments and survey experiments, I find that messaging that people in the Latinx community get from elites or other people, messaging in many different ways, right? Either verbal or in different ways, can shift their levels of belonging and inclusion, right? So even though we may not necessarily see it in the surveys, right? There are these shifts that are happening, which kind of relate to what Igor was talking about earlier, right? Like you're placed in different contexts and then you all of a sudden feel like you don't belong, right? So you get a message from, or you look at the news and something happens, all of a sudden you don't feel like, you belong, right? So there are these shifts that are happening and I can capture that, and I have captured that in my experiments, which is quite meaningful, right? Because it means that these levels of belonging can shift and can be moved and manipulated, both for good but also for bad, right? And these can have influential consequences. So, yeah.
Yeah, and this actually comes to, I have a two-part question based just on this, and I want to flag that Walter in the chat has shared that his sense of belonging changes by the day, and I think that resonates with a lot of us based on the news cycle. And so my two-part question, my two-part question is, is this something that changes quite a bit? And it sounds like it certainly can. Or is there some range that's like fixed, So if you think of like happiness, it's like, yeah, I'm generally a positive person, but it fluctuates up and down day to day, or I'm generally negative, but it fluctuates. So I'm kind of curious how belonging maps to that kind of thing. And then B, going towards the election and its influence on turnout and registration and all of those things, what are things that someone could do who hypothetically wanted to increase turnout among the Latinx community to help? We should want to increase belonging anyway. Let's put that there. At least I feel that way. But if we wanted to promote turnout via belonging, what are some of the things that positively impact belonging?
So sort of speaking to the first part, whether, the extent to which it fluctuates, one of the interesting things about my research and what I find is that it is much harder to move it in the positive direction than it is to move it in the negative direction.
Gotcha.
So the effects appear to be strong in the negative direction, right? Those negative messages, hostile, vitriolic rhetoric, right? Like this is all, it's bad, it's detrimental, and that seems to have a bigger impact than the positive messages. And that's interesting to think about why that might be the case. Is it that positive messages are not being taken as genuine, as really, kind of meaningful? that might be the explanation. I don't necessarily know, right? To tease out that mechanism is hard, but I'm sort of thinking that's what it might be, that some of these messages of positivity, of trying to signal to people that they are welcomed might be taken as pandering, right? His pandering, or might be taken as disingenuous. And so that relates to the second part of, how can we think about the election in the context of what we've been talking about, belonging. And I'll add that, I think it is not a sort of a one-shot thing, right? And I think when thinking about Latinx politics and thinking about Latinx voters, campaigns oftentimes only think about them every 4 years because, like they're always, they're sort of the dormant sleeping giant that has been trying to wake up. And now all of a sudden, like, we really need to mobilize them because it's the end of July and the election's around the corner, right? So this idea of investing in the community long term might really be helpful in fostering greater perceptions of belonging, right? As opposed to these kind of every 4 years, let me reach out to them and tell them, with all these Spanish language ads that I
I was just thinking about that. Yep.
So I think, I think there's some of that, and that my research speaks to a little bit of that sort of thinking, how much harder it is in the positive to move belonging in the positive direction, because I think a lot of those messages are kind of taken as not really coming from the right place.
Pandering, like you said.
Yeah, pandering. Yeah.
And it's pretty obvious when it's every 4 years and all of a sudden it's late July and we're super interested in what the Latinx community, wants and is voting for and all of those things, and treating the whole community as a monolith and all of that as well. I'm sort of reminded, and I don't know why I'm thinking about this, but like a friendship, right? Like I can sit here and say nice things to you, but I would only take one horrible thing to just shut it all down, right? And then it would be really hard to repair that. I don't know why I'm having this revelation about human relationships in real time on YouTube. I'm like, oh, right, and you can't be that friend who every 4 years is like, can I borrow $20? By the way, I'm here for you. And just that, so, belonging is being nice to people in an ongoing way, which again is a big part of the national conversation we're having. And,
you're going to have a few phone calls to make after this.
Yeah, I know. I was like, sorry. This is a big open apology to my whole family and friends. So this is sort of a broader question. I think at least a lot of white people are thinking about, which is how can I help make this a society that is more welcoming, inclusive, and is it problematic to say, yes, inclusive towards the U.S. as a whole, defined as a white majority or whatever majority country? I mean, belonging to what and inclusive to what seems like a complicated part of this story, right? And who defines what that is?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a good question. I think that gets at a lot of really intricacies of, right, what does it mean to really be inclusive? And I think that what I'll add there is that, at least, and also in my work, it is a lot about respect, right? And it is a lot about not just in many ways being the voice of I'm trying to include you, and therefore because I tell you that I included you, you're all of a sudden included. No, you actually have to be treated with respect and with dignity, right? So I think those things really kind of get at the core. But yeah, I think it's a tricky thing, and we can go on and on and on, like sort of what does this mean, right? The words inclusion get really thrown right and left in a lot of university settings, right? In a lot of different sort of company settings and work settings about, we care about diversity and we really care about inclusion. What does that mean? What are people actually doing to address issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And so that actions obviously speak louder than words, right? It's not just enough to say, we are inclusive of you, right? But what are you actually, like, what is your demographic makeup of your company look like? Like, things like that. Are you actually doing the hard work of being inclusive?
Yeah, and you and I talked about this a little bit before the show, and I've been rethinking the word inclusive and inclusion myself in as conversations about Black Lives Matter are happening, and it's pointed out to me that if I'm saying inclusion and inclusive as a white person who's multi-generational American, am I saying, yes, welcome to like my world, but not trying to understand another person's world, right? Is it sort of white supremacist in itself to say, aha, I am the person who decides if you're included or not, right? And it seems sort of white centering. So that's,
yeah. And I think a big part of that too is sort of in many ways letting people define their own belonging and inclusion in their own terms, right? As opposed to imposing what you think inclusion should be.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I want to make sure we have time. Sorry, Igor, you say something?
No, that's okay. Right on.
Yeah. I want to make sure we have time to get to your work on political elites. You've done a number of great papers. We talked about at the very beginning on, Latino candidates, Latinx people running for office. What is the story here as far as the politics of inclusion, belonging, and being a legislator or running for office?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, just as I'm interested in belonging sort of at the individual level, there is a lot to be said about belonging and inclusion, or the inclusion that political parties and elites are doing or not doing in my case, and what I find of racial and ethnic minorities, in particular of Latinx candidates. And so the work that I do looks at the extent to which political parties and groups that are active in the process of just sort of getting candidates to run for office tend to under support certain demographic groups over others. And in this case, I find in one of my papers that Latinx congressional candidates are less likely to, in many ways, be supported by party elites. And this has consequences because party elites and their support, whether it is financial or non-financial, matters a great deal for whether or not people make a run for office and whether or not they eventually win. It's sort of in many ways, these elites and groups are gatekeepers, and they impact and they shape the way that we see the slate of candidates once you see the ballot, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think we all look at our ballots, or we look at who ultimately makes it to office, and it's a lot of people who look the same and are from similar, they're all, old white cis male lawyers or something like very, very specific demographic that ends up making it to power. So is the argument here that it's a gatekeeper phase way earlier on? It's not really about like, oh, do Latinx candidates win? It's who kind of gets to run in the first place. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly right. So it's not so much that that Latinx candidates are less likely to win. Actually, we find that they're just as equally likely to win. And in many cases, the work of other people has shown that, for example, in some areas, Latinx candidates do really, really well once they run for office. But it is before they get there, sort of before they run, right? Sort of what happens and what we call it the pre-emergence stage of their candidacy. And that is where there is a lot of room for improvement. And I, in my research, that's where a lot of the things go wrong, really, for the emergence stage and the sort of the post once you see your ballot. So that is certainly the case. That they is not necessarily that they don't have the qualities to run for office. They're just as qualified. They're just as experienced to run for office. But it is that they face these barriers at the entrance level in many ways, because it is really super costly to run for office. It is really difficult. And so if you don't necessarily have access to resources and or are supported by party elites and party networks, then you are not going to be in the position in many ways to run a strong campaign and then make it out of that campaign and win.
So Igor, you said you're not particularly involved. Any chance you want to run for office? We'll call some gatekeepers. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I'm still trying to crack through the entertainment industry. It sounds they sound very parallel. It's like if you can schmooze the agents, the managers, and you get them on your side, and then hopefully they can prop you up. It sounds very similar to what the political system.
This is true. This is the first time anyone has ever actually drawn a connection that makes sense to me between comedy, coming up in comedy and coming up in politics. Certainly, comedy and politics overlap at the top for sure. So what could we do if we hypothetically wish to help make it so that we see more candidates, whether Latinx or Black or non-male or whatever candidates? So is it, I don't know, do we petition our local parties? Or what should we be doing?
I mean, I think one thing
how little do I know about local politics?
I mean,
Petition a local party? I don't even know what that means. Yeah.
Infiltrate the local party. Yeah, I think.
I don't know what that means. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one way, right? Get involved in the local party, right? Change in many ways who those activists and who those party elites are and become, right? Because then if the party really prioritizes supporting certain candidates over others, then we will see a big difference, right? In the candidates that are actually running and that make it out. And so, and that's in many ways, right? Like the parties are still very much gatekeepers in many ways. But if the makeup of the party changes because we get involved in local politics, we get involved in whatever group, it doesn't necessarily have to be the official party, but there are a lot of other people that are actors in these processes that help candidates or help recruit candidates, right? They could be different types of organizations, either they're ideological or sometimes professional organizations, right? Maybe we'll get a comedian to run for office and you can put together a bunch of comedians.
2020, yeah.
Yeah.
No.
Wait, I don't know. Yeah.
No.
An action committee or something like that. And so you can, right, change in many ways the slate of candidates by getting involved in that way, right, in having a say in that process.
Well, we have just time for a couple more questions. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface, but a question from Adrian and Diana. I see you. They're both great questions. I'm going to do them out of order. Adrian asks, how have you seen belonging or not belonging affect Latino political engagement, not just voting, but willingness to take political action? So I guess I would imagine, Adrian, correct me if I'm wrong, running for office counts, but you did mention earlier, I'm now just building on Adrian's question selfishly, some of the interesting nuances around protests. How does it play out in some of these other types of political engagement? Yeah.
So perceptions of belonging matter a great deal for the more sort of traditional or electoral forms of participation, like voting. But I do find that perceptions of, so not belonging, but your perceptions of whether or not you're an outsider, if you are a politicized person, right? If you're someone who in many ways is already connected to politics and cares about politics, influence your likelihood of participating and engaging in protests. So it is not necessarily that you. So again, I guess in many ways, right, feeling like you're an outsider, but feeling politicized, then shapes your propensity to engage in not voting, right, but protest behavior.
So is being an outsider the opposite of belonging, or are they two kind of different things?
They're different things. So I call them, they're sort of it's more than a spectrum, but they're different dimensions of the concept of belonging, right? So, you might feel like an outsider because you're being pushed out of this society, right? And so if you're politicized enough, that will actually push you to participate in protest behavior. But perceptions of being an outsider doesn't push you to, or I don't find evidence that it actually is related to the more electoral traditional forms of behavior. So it makes sense, right, that if you think you're an outsider, you may perhaps think that the electoral system doesn't quite work for you, right? Or is not the way to get an answer, to get some sort of change, right? And that you really think that protest behavior and contentious politics are the way to go, right? So that those are some of the nuances with the belonging items and different ways of thinking about belonging and inclusion.
It also makes me think now back to our opening conversation about, can you feel that you belong and also feel that you're not included? And it sounds like it's a resounding yes. And another example is, to me, the Black Lives Matter protest, which is that I don't feel I'm being included, or the Black community feels, members of the Black community feel they aren't being included, but that they do belong, and therefore you see this
Yeah. So that would be high on this relative component, which we talked about earlier. But high on the relative and then low on the other component on the individual. Right. And so that in many ways sort of pushes, and I do find that, right? So I have some evidence, although I primarily look at the Latinx community, I do also look at perceptions of belonging among Blacks. And I do find that high perceivedness of being outsider and that this pushes them also to engage in protest. Not Black Lives Matter specifically, but just protest behavior in general.
So it's like it's an inverse relationship.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. But interestingly enough, this outsider perceptions of being either an insider or an outsider, and I ask it both in the positive and in the negative direction, doesn't really shape voting, right? Does not seem to have any influence on voting.
Okay. Yeah, I was like, okay, but I guess if you feel that the electoral system doesn't serve you, protesting makes sense. If you're an insider or an outsider, you belong. More belonging contributes to voting, but being an outsider doesn't affect voting.
Yes.
That's really interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Or at least I don't find evidence that it might, but I don't find evidence that that it influences it. Right.
Again, I don't ask my students to watch this show. That seems like too much of my face for anyone to look at. But you just said so much better than I ever have to my students about why you can't prove a theory. And so just the way that you said that is such perfect, exemplary political science of, it might be true, but I don't have any evidence that supports it. Sorry if that was patronizing, but that's solid political science language. I also want to flag early on, for those of you who've been watching the show since the beginning, Angela mentioned mechanisms, and we started the show talking about causal mechanisms back in March. And so thank you also for that top vocabulary term from the last 20 shows. So, okay, last question, because I do want to keep an eye, give people their evenings back. But last question comes from Diana, who asks, are there good surveys of undocumented populations? If not, what can we do to ethically survey these communities?
So there's I would say very few nationally nationally representative surveys of undocumented people or undocumented youth. What's the question specifically about youth?
Just populations.
Populations. Yeah. Yeah. So there's very, very little and very few of them. But there are some, right? There's some work that does look at them. And I mean, I think that in many ways, that question's spot on, right? It's really difficult to survey this population and to do it in a way that is ethical and that really sort of maintains their privacy and that, doesn't take away from too much of their time already, right? Given the difficulties that they face. So, I think that a lot of the people that are doing this kind of work, we have to commend them for not just surveying them, right? But also a lot of the really fascinating, interesting, and important work that's coming out focuses also on a lot of qualitative work. And that has followed a lot of these undocumented youth and people over time. And so it's a hard balance to try to strike between, being ethical given the research, but also tried in many ways to study this population and give a voice to them through our research. Yeah.
Do you, without putting them in danger or using too many resources and so forth, do you include undocumented populations in your work on belonging, or is this all, I guess, documented?
Yeah. So I would say, it's hard. I do include them, and I include them in one survey. We don't necessarily ask them whether or not they're undocumented, right? So that is a really, really tricky thing to do. But in one of the largest surveys that I use, we include both registered and non-registered individuals. The non-registered are individuals who could be undocumented, and some who are and some who are not. And so we will ask them, we won't directly ask them whether or not they're undocumented, but we'll ask them in many ways if they can describe whether or not they have whether or not they have applied for citizenship or whether or not, and some of these of the other questions. In many ways, we can backtrack whether or not they're undocumented.
Right.
But we don't directly ask them whether they are. Yeah.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah, and I would say the other thing too is that I think what makes it difficult in terms of getting sort of a nationally representative sample of them is that, you know, we don't necessarily have an existing database or list, right, of undocumented people, right? So usually,
by definition, there's no documentation.
By definition,
yeah.
By definition. Although
the undocumented list. Let's have a look at that.
Although I will
Where's that
add,
document?
Yeah, I will add that, you know, the administration right now is trying to exclude undocumented people from the count, the base population count that's going to be used for apportionment, right? So, I mean, the administration is claiming that they're going to try to identify all of the undocumented people, which is, you know, going to be technically impossible. So, you know, that's another thing. But we don't know. All of the estimates that we have about the undocumented people are just that, estimates based on data that we can backtrack. So we don't have a national database or list. Except for those who have applied for DACA, that's the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. So we do know who they are because they've applied to this program. So it's nearly impossible to collect this data on nationally representative. But that's why a lot of people will use different sampling strategies. If they're doing surveys, they'll do different sampling strategies. And if they're doing qualitative work, there's also this snowball sampling. So one person might lead to another and lead to another based on that. Yeah.
And so you're having kind of longer one-on-one conversations, and then they say, and then you should talk to my friend so-and-so, and that's sort of a way to get a mapping of populations that wouldn't be on a list, basically.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that is a population that's definitionally very, very difficult to understand and can be very problematic. I'm thinking also of the citizenship test on the census, right? Where it's like, that's asking that puts a lot of people in danger if they answer it one way or another, and can really suppress responses, whether you're a citizen or not, which is something that,
Is it fair to assume that most undocumented people in undocumented populations would tend to not feel like they belong? Is that, or are there other factors that I'm missing?
So actually, so there's a lot of awesome work. And another shout out, Roberto Gonzalez does a lot of really incredible work that particularly looks like undocumented people and belonging among the undocumented. So he finds that there's variation. There's both, their sense of belonging moves, right, fluctuates, but there's variation in that some places and spaces are more conducive to lead them to develop higher perceptions of belonging, but also to lead them to lower perceptions of belonging, right? So we can just use DACA as an example, right? Having a documentation status, DACA, right, which has been used as the status of documented, right, which now is, DACA allows them to have permits to work, and it's a reprieve from deportation. That has allowed them in many ways, and has allowed some people to feel like they belong, right? That their membership is validated in some ways. But at the same time, right, sort of the constant way in which the administration and different parties use this community as a token, right, also makes people in the community feel like they don't belong, right? Right, because they're not, the DACA was about to be in many ways, or, the Trump administration attempted to put a stop on DACA, right? And so that particular moment was really, really difficult and challenging. And so,
So this, I've kept everyone way past, as always. I always think it's going to be an hour-long show, and it never is. So let's just admit that 8:15 is the practice ending time for the show. But I've got to wrap it up. I feel like we could keep going for hours. We'll just have to have you back. So we are going to come back in the fall at some point. I don't know exactly when. Here's hoping there's an election in November. I shouldn't even talk about that. But the plan will be to have a few episodes in the lead up to the election. So I'd be very curious, Angela, to have you back and learn more about your belonging work, and also thinking about how to not tokenize the entire Latino population when asking them to go out to vote in November. Certainly a conversation we'll all keep having. For folks who've been watching, if you are able to donate, any amount helps. The donations this week do go to Kids in Need of Defense, which helps give pro bono legal services and trauma support and family support and all kinds of great things to migrant children, refugees, and very related to what we've been talking about. So please feel free to donate right there, and I will donate it all directly. Angela, where can people keep up with your work and follow your insights and so forth?
They can check my Twitter feed or check my website as well. I'm always posting relevant stuff to politics, Latinx politics, race and ethnicity.
Yep. And your website, so Angela Exocampo on Twitter, and your website is just angelaexocampo.com.
Yep.
Correct. Awesome. Yeah, absolutely check out Angela's work. It's super fantastic. And yeah, lots of, I learn a lot by following you on Twitter. So I hope others do as well. Igor, where can people find you?
Oh, they can find me on Twitter or Instagram, much more trivial, much more insignificant stuff. Iggy Smalls jokes on Twitter and Instagram.
Excellent. Well, I find your posts informative and also funny. So,
thank you.
So there's that. Yes. All right. And my name is Andrea Jones-Rooy. You can follow me right here. But most of all, donate right here, and I'll send it over to Kids in Need of Defense. Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all again for watching tonight. For those of you who've watched multiple shows or even all of the shows, I don't know how you lived through that, but thank you. This has been a very valuable way for me to get through quarantine, to get to reconnect with my comedian and political science friends, and frankly, my family and friends over the chat. So personally, this has been very meaningful to me. So thank you all for doing that. Stay tuned for our fall schedule. And big thank you to Angela and Igor once again for joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.